So when you think of the American Revolution, what comes to mind? Probably Lexington and Concord, maybe the Declaration of Independence, right? But what if I told you the very first major military campaign of the war wasn't even on American soil? No, it was a full-blown invasion of Canada. Let's get into one of the most overlooked and frankly disastrous parts of the entire war. And that brings us to the big question. In 1775, the brand new Continental Congress okayed this massive invasion of Quebec. They were feeling confident, they were idealistic, and they really thought they'd be welcomed as heroes. Instead, the whole thing was a complete and utter catastrophe. So what happened? Why did it go so incredibly wrong? Well, it all started with this grand idea, which turns out was a fatally flawed one. They called it the 14th colony. You see, American leaders were so convinced that their revolutionary ideas were this universal gift. They truly believed the French Canadians were just sitting there, waiting for someone to help them throw off British rule and join the party. It was a classic case of just being a little too sure you're right. And this really gets to the two-part logic of the whole mission. On the one hand, it was pure strategy. They had to secure their northern border because a British-held Canada was the perfect launchpad for attacks into New York and New England. But just as important was this idealistic goal. They genuinely thought they could just march in, say, "We're here to liberate you," and the French Canadians would just flock to their side. But all that ambition, it was about to slam headfirst into a brutal, brutal reality. The invasion was a two-pronged attack. One army went up Lake Champlain towards Montreal, but the other, led by a guy named Benedict Arnold, decided to take a supposed shortcut right through the uncharted wilderness of Maine to surprise Quebec City. That shortcut, it turned into an absolute legend of a nightmare. Let's just stop and try to picture what this march was really like. We're talking about 1,100 men dragging these heavy, poorly made boats through freezing rivers and deep, swampy forests. Their food went bad in just a few weeks, so they had to eat their own shoe leather, their cartridge boxes, anything. And then came the diseases. Smallpox and typhus just tore through the camp. They were soaked, they were freezing, and they were starving for nearly 2 solid months. This wasn't a march, it was a pure test of human survival. And here's the most important part. The battle was basically lost before it even started. When Arnold's 600 or so survivors finally stumbled out of the woods, they weren't an army. They were a band of sick, starving guys in ripped-up summer uniforms right as a vicious Canadian winter was rolling in. So, after going through all of that, what's waiting for them? Not some little town, oh no. Quebec City was probably the strongest, most hardcore fortress in all of North America. I mean, it's a city built for war, sitting on top of a giant cliff overlooking the St. Lawrence River. This chart really lays out the impossible odds they were facing. On one side, you've got the attackers, totally exhausted, starving, freezing, with no winter gear and no big cannons to even think about breaking down those walls. And on the other side, the defenders are well-fed, rested, warm, and sitting behind a massive fortress. I mean, it was a complete and total mismatch. But even with everything stacked against them, they decided to risk it all. You see, their soldiers' enlistments were up on January 1st. It was basically now or never. So on New Year's Eve, 1775, they rolled the dice on one last desperate assault on the city. And that's when Mother Nature decided she wanted to join the fight too. The plan itself, it sounded okay. Attack from 2 different sides at the same time, split the defenders' attention. But then the blizzard hit, and it was a double-edged sword. Sure, it gave them cover, but it also created total chaos. Guys got lost in the blinding snow, and, this is the key, their gunpowder got soaked, which made their muskets completely useless. The attack just fell apart. One of the commanders was killed instantly, and Benedict Arnold got shot in the leg, taking him right out of the fight. There's a quote from an American officer who was there, and it just says it all. "The storm rendered the men's arms useless." Can you imagine that? Their main weapons were gone. They were basically trying to storm one of the world's strongest fortresses with just bayonets. It was a disaster. Hundreds were captured, and a whole lot more were killed. Now, you'd think the assault was the worst of it, but the agony wasn't over yet. The survivors of that attack, still riddled with smallpox, actually tried to keep up a siege through the dead of winter. It was just a sad, hopeless situation. This timeline really shows you how the whole campaign just slowly bled out. After that failed attack in December, they just hung on. They suffered through the winter, getting sicker and weaker. The real nail in the coffin came in May.
The river thawed, and a fleet of British ships sailed in, with thousands of fresh troops. That was it. The siege was broken, and the retreat began.
And let's be clear, this wasn't some organized withdrawal. It was a mad dash south, a desperate race to escape the British and the disease that was still killing them off. The Americans left a trail of sick and dying men all the way back to New York. The grand invasion to create a 14th colony ended in a chaotic, humiliating rout.
So, in the end, the invasion failed because of a perfect storm, really. Logistical nightmares, impossible odds, and just plain terrible luck. But it does leave us with a pretty fascinating thought to chew on. What if that blizzard never happened? What if, against all odds, they'd actually captured Quebec? Would Canada be part of the United States today? It's one of history's biggest what-ifs, all born from America's very first and very failed foreign war.